It was supposed to be the happiest day of Sarah's life, a day of love, vows, and new beginnings. But as the guests stood in awe, watching the bride walk down the aisle, a shadow lurked in the corner of the room. Her mother, Evelyn, had kept a dark secret for months. And in one shocking, blood-soaked moment, it all came crashing down, shattering not just a wedding, but a family. The man Sarah loved lay dead at her feet, and the woman she trusted most had killed him. The question wasn't just why, it was how far a mother would go to protect her own broken heart. The morning sun poured through the windows of the grand hall, casting a golden glow over the sea of white lilies that adorned the ceremony space. The scent of fresh flowers hung in the air, mingling with the soft hum of whispered conversations. Family members and friends filled the room, their faces beaming with joy as they watched Sarah, radiant in her lace-trimmed gown, step forward to marry the man of her dreams. Her heart raced, her breath steady yet filled with the excitement of the day she had waited for. She caught the eye of her mother, Evelyn, who stood at the front with a proud smile. Evelyn's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, but there was something in her eyes, something unspoken that Sarah couldn't place. She didn't have time to dwell on it. This was her moment, the culmination of months of careful planning. She reached the altar, her gaze locked with Mark's, and everything else faded into the background. She was finally living her dream. But behind the scenes, a secret festered, a secret that was about to unravel everything. As the vows began, a silence fell over the room that seemed too thick to be real. Sarah's voice, full of love as she recited her promises to Mark, was the only sound that seemed to pierce the stillness. And then, Sarah noticed it, the slight tremble in Evelyn's hands. Her mother, always poised and composed, suddenly looked anything but. Evelyn's face, once soft with maternal pride, twisted with something darker. Her eyes widened in fear, as though she had just realized she was standing on the edge of a precipice, one wrong step from falling. The guests, sensing the shift, exchanged glances, whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd. Sarah, in the bliss of the moment, didn't know what to make of it. She continued, her heart full, but her mother's expression, filled with dread, didn't go unnoticed by those close enough to see it. Evelyn's lips quivered, and she swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. Her eyes darted nervously to Mark, who stood just beside Sarah, unaware of the turmoil building in his future mother-in-law. Sarah's joy seemed to contrast sharply with the horror that consumed Evelyn. Without warning, the tension broke. A scream, sharp and raw, echoed across the hall, sending a jolt through everyone. The wedding guests froze, the air thick with disbelief. The bride's smile faded, and her heart skipped a beat as she turned to see the source of the scream. Evelyn was standing, a knife gripped tightly in her trembling hands, blood staining the blade as she looked down at Mark. Mark's face, once full of love, was now frozen in shock. His eyes were wide, his lips parted in confusion and disbelief as the blood spread rapidly from the wound on his chest. He stumbled back, crashing to the floor, his body limp, life draining from him faster than Sarah could comprehend. The guests screamed, some frozen in place, others rushing toward the scene. But all Sarah could do was stare, her mouth dry, her body unable to move as the man she had promised her life to fell to the ground. She watched in horrified silence as Evelyn stood over him, her face etched with sorrow, rage, and something far more painful. Sarah's legs buckled beneath her, her grip on Mark's hand loosening as she crumpled to the floor beside him. Her world tilted on its axis, and she could feel the cold air rush from her lungs as she realized that the day she had imagined for so long had turned into a nightmare. Her mind screamed, but her voice didn't come. She looked up at her mother, whose expression, once full of pride, was now filled with something darker, something that she had never seen in Evelyn before. The blood-soaked knife in Evelyn's hands, the utter shock on her face, and the silence that filled the room around them were too much to bear. "Why?" Sarah whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. Her eyes locked with her mother's, the woman who had raised her, who had taught her what love was. Now, in this moment, she realized that everything had been a lie. Evelyn's expression softened, regret crossing her face for just a moment before it was replaced by something colder, more distant. She dropped the knife, her hands trembling as she stepped back, avoiding her daughter's gaze. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "but I couldn't let him take everything from us." In the weeks that followed, the town buzzed with shock and disbelief. Evelyn, once a well-respected and admired woman, now stood as a symbol of betrayal and madness. The whispers began almost immediately, traveling faster than the speed of gossip, as her dark secret was laid bare for all to see. The community struggled to reconcile the image they had of Evelyn with the woman who had committed such a horrific act. How could someone so composed, so seemingly perfect, have done something so cold and brutal? The answers didn't come easily. For many, it was too difficult to process. Evelyn, the loving mother, the kind neighbor, the person everyone turned to, how could she have been capable of such a crime? Her once pristine reputation was forever shattered, and the town turned its back on her. People who had once smiled at her on the street now avoided her gaze, their pity replaced by fear. The image of Evelyn, standing over Mark's body, was burned into the minds of all who witnessed it. As Sarah sat in the courtroom, the question loomed like a dark cloud overhead: why? Why had her mother, the woman she had always trusted, killed the man she was supposed to marry? The mystery surrounding Evelyn's actions only deepened as the days passed. Evelyn's cold demeanor during the trial made it impossible for Sarah to understand her mother's true feelings. Evelyn never apologized, never explained, only stating that it was something she had to do. But there was no satisfaction in the answer. The question remained unanswered, and Sarah was left in the echo of it, haunted by the man she had lost, the mother she could no longer recognize, and the life that was now shattered beyond repair. The words hung in the air, unanswered, as Sarah turned away from the trial, her eyes empty and filled with grief. Sarah had always thought her relationship with her mother, Evelyn, was the perfect example of familial love. Evelyn had been her rock throughout her life, supportive, loving, and seemingly unshakable. But as Sarah grew older, she began to notice subtle cracks in the foundation of their relationship. Evelyn had always been emotionally distant, never fully opening up to Sarah about her personal life. The smile she wore for others was often tight, as if she were hiding something. Sarah, caught up in her own world of growing up and preparing for her future, never questioned her mother's strange silences or the coldness that seemed to emerge at the oddest moments. But looking back, Sarah would see the signs: the long hours Evelyn spent alone in her room, the wistful looks when she thought no one was watching, and the heavy sighs she tried to mask as mere fatigue. For years, Evelyn had pushed away the possibility of love, focusing all her energy on Sarah, on the outward appearance of being the perfect mother. But in private, her loneliness grew. Her marriage had ended in heartbreak, and her attempts to find solace had led her to make decisions she would later regret. Evelyn's facade had begun to crack long before Mark entered the picture. Mark entered Sarah's life like a whirlwind. Tall, handsome, and with an air of confidence that was intoxicating, he was everything Sarah had ever dreamed of. She saw him as a knight in shining armor, someone who would rescue her from the ordinary. But beneath his polished exterior, Mark was far from the perfect man Sarah believed him to be. What Sarah didn't know, and what Evelyn did, was the twisted history Mark carried with him. He was a master manipulator, charming those around him with ease, using his good looks and smooth talk to win people over. He could make anyone feel special, important, needed. And that was precisely what he did with Evelyn. Their affair began slowly, as most dangerous things do, through moments of mutual loneliness and whispered secrets. Mark had wormed his way into Evelyn's heart, promising her everything she had longed for: companionship, love, a future together. But his promises were hollow. He didn't love her. He saw her as a tool to use to get closer to Sarah, to secure his place in her life, and, ultimately, to control her. Evelyn, vulnerable and starved for affection, had fallen for it. The affair wasn't just an escape for her, it was a brief moment of validation, a reminder that she was still desirable, still worthy of love. But as the days passed, the guilt gnawed at her. Mark, despite all his promises, showed his true colors. He wasn't after Evelyn's heart, but her weakness. He had no intention of building a future with her. He wanted Sarah, and his power over both women gave him an intoxicating sense of control. Evelyn's guilt consumed her more and more as the wedding day approached. Each time Sarah spoke about her upcoming marriage, the tight knot in Evelyn's stomach grew. She watched her daughter, radiant in her naivete, preparing for a life that Evelyn knew, deep down, would be full of the same heartache she herself had suffered. But it wasn't just the fear of Sarah's heartbreak that tore at Evelyn, it was something much darker. A growing sense of jealousy. She resented Sarah's innocence, her happiness, and the love that was about to envelop her. Evelyn saw in Sarah a reflection of her younger self, the woman she used to be, full of hope and untested by the cruelty of life. Mark was now the object of Sarah's affection, just as he had once been for Evelyn. The jealousy twisted inside her, poisoning her every thought. She began to see Sarah's love for Mark not as a beautiful bond, but as a betrayal of what Evelyn had once shared with him. The affair was no longer just a mistake, it was a prison that Evelyn couldn't escape. The constant reminder that Sarah, her daughter, was about to marry the man Evelyn had once loved, turned her heart bitter. She resented Sarah for having something Evelyn couldn't keep: her youthful innocence and her future. Evelyn had always prided herself on being a good mother. She had spent her entire life dedicated to Sarah, protecting her from the pain Evelyn had known. But now, with Mark about to marry her daughter, Evelyn couldn't help but feel betrayed. It wasn't just that Mark was taking Sarah away from her, though that was painful enough, it was that Evelyn had given everything for Sarah, and in return, she felt utterly alone. She had sacrificed her happiness, her desires, and her dreams to give Sarah the perfect life, only for her daughter to turn to the very man who had broken her own heart. The love Evelyn felt for Sarah, once pure and protective, had begun to twist into something darker. She became possessive, not just of Mark, but of Sarah. It was as if she couldn't bear to see her daughter grow up, to see her fall in love, to see her take the same steps Evelyn had taken years ago, steps that had led her to despair. Evelyn's love for her daughter, once unconditional, was now entangled with resentment. She watched Sarah prepare for her wedding, the excitement in her daughter's eyes only deepening Evelyn's sense of loss. She had given Sarah everything, but in the end, Sarah had something Evelyn could never have again: hope. Evelyn's emotional unraveling reached its peak just days before the wedding. She had tried, in vain, to reach out to Sarah, to talk, to explain her feelings, but every time she opened her mouth, the words stuck in her throat. Sarah was so caught up in the excitement of her wedding that she couldn't or wouldn't see the darkness growing within her mother. Evelyn's actions became more erratic. She snapped at Sarah over trivial things, her temper flaring over insignificant comments. The stress of keeping the affair a secret, combined with her increasing jealousy and guilt, made Evelyn's grip on reality slip. She couldn't keep pretending to be the proud, supportive mother Sarah had always known. One night, after a particularly tense conversation where Sarah questioned her mother's odd behavior, Evelyn broke down. Her emotions, which had been building for so long, finally exploded. She felt like a failure, like she had lost everything: her love for Mark, her role as a mother, and her own identity. The fragile ties that held their family together snapped in that moment, and Evelyn realized she was standing at the edge of a precipice, with no way back. The only way to regain control was to take drastic action, and the wedding, the symbol of Sarah's new life, was the perfect place to make her move. The days leading up to Sarah's wedding passed in a blur for Evelyn. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, a relentless weight pressing on her chest. Every time she looked at Sarah, her heart filled with a painful mixture of love and resentment. Sarah was radiant, unaware, so blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Evelyn had always been the strong one, the dependable mother. But now, she was nothing more than a woman broken by her own choices. She couldn't escape the images of Mark, the way he had smiled at her with empty promises, how he had used his charm to draw her in. Every kiss, every stolen moment with him, felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever wanted to protect. She had been so desperate for affection, for validation, that she had fallen prey to his manipulation. And now, that same man was about to marry her daughter. Evelyn sat in the dim light of her bedroom, the house silent around her. The weight of the knife in her hand felt heavier with each passing minute. She had never intended for things to spiral out of control like this, but now there seemed to be no turning back. She was suffocating, trapped in a life she had built on lies. And the guilt, there was no escaping it. Her mind raced as she stared at the blade. Would one swift action end this torment? Was this the only way to take back control? Mark had always been the master of deception. He knew exactly what to say, when to say it, and who to say it to. His charm was undeniable. Something about him made people gravitate toward him, desperate to earn his approval. He had wrapped Sarah around his finger, using her love as a means to solidify his place in her life. But with Evelyn, it was different. Mark didn't want just Sarah. He wanted to control both of them. It was the ultimate power play. He had seduced Evelyn, promising her a future where they could live freely, without the constraints of the past. He told her what she wanted to hear, how beautiful she was, how desirable, how he could give her everything she had been denied. And for a while, Evelyn believed him. But as time went on, the facade began to crumble. Mark's true nature revealed itself slowly. He wasn't a man who wanted love. He wanted dominance. Every compliment, every touch, had strings attached, pulling Evelyn deeper into his web. He used her emotions as his personal playground, knowing exactly when to show affection and when to withdraw, keeping her on edge, desperate for his validation. It wasn't long before Evelyn realized she had been played, but by then, it was too late. Mark had dug himself into her heart, and no matter how much she tried to pull away, his influence remained. As the wedding day drew nearer, the fear that had once been a whisper in her mind now screamed at her. Mark was about to marry her daughter, and Evelyn was helpless to stop it. Evelyn's emotions became a tangled mess of love, jealousy, and betrayal. She loved her daughter deeply. No mother could deny the bond between them. But now, as she watched Sarah prepare for her wedding, that love had become suffocated by a deep, bitter resentment. Evelyn saw Mark through Sarah's eyes, a man who would sweep her off her feet, a man who would love her the way he never loved Evelyn. It was too much. How could she watch Sarah walk into a marriage with Mark, knowing the pain he had caused her, knowing the part she had played in his manipulation? Sarah was about to marry the man who had stolen everything from her mother, a man who had made Evelyn feel like she was nothing more than a plaything. But it wasn't just jealousy, there was hatred now, a burning rage that Evelyn couldn't control. She hated Mark for what he had done to her, for using her vulnerability as a means to get close to Sarah. She hated herself for falling for his lies, for not seeing his true nature sooner. And she hated Sarah, not for any fault of her own, but for being the innocent bystander in this twisted game of manipulation and desire. Evelyn could feel her heart breaking, piece by piece. Her love for Sarah was still there, but it was suffocating under the weight of all the unresolved emotions. The jealousy twisted deeper, the hatred spiraled higher. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to fix the mess she had created. But every thought led her back to the same conclusion: she was losing everything. And it was her fault. Sarah had been so caught up in the excitement of the wedding that she hadn't noticed the subtle shifts in her mother's behavior. Evelyn, once her rock, had become distant and cold. At first, Sarah chalked it up to pre-wedding stress. But as the days passed, the distance only seemed to grow. There were moments, small moments, that didn't sit right with Sarah. A fleeting glance between her mother and Mark that felt off, the way Evelyn's smile never quite reached her eyes anymore, the long silences during family dinners. Sarah tried to push it aside, focusing instead on the happiness of the wedding, the love she was about to share with Mark. But deep down, something felt wrong. One evening, just days before the wedding, Sarah confronted her mother. "Mom, are you okay? You've been acting strange lately." Evelyn's eyes hardened, her jaw tight. "I'm fine, darling. Don't worry about me." But Sarah wasn't convinced. "You're not fine, Mom. What's going on? If something's bothering you, I want to help." Evelyn's face softened for a moment, but then she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just some things I'm working through. You should focus on your wedding. It's your special day." But Sarah could sense the underlying tension in her mother's voice. Whatever it wasn't something that could be fixed with a smile. Evelyn's emotional walls were higher than ever, and Sarah could no longer ignore the fact that something dark was lurking just beneath the surface. By the time the wedding day arrived, Evelyn knew there was no turning back. She had pushed everything to the brink, hoping for a resolution, but the truth was clear now. She could no longer be the woman Sarah needed her to be. The pain, the jealousy, the guilt, it all boiled down to this one moment. Evelyn stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, and for the first time in years, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. She wasn't Sarah's mother anymore. She was someone broken, someone who had been consumed by her own actions. Her grip on the knife tightened. It was the only way she could take back control. Mark, standing there in the tuxedo, smiling at Sarah, was about to take everything from her. She had no choice but to stop him. The wedding bells rang in the distance, but Evelyn knew that the love and the future Sarah dreamed of were about to be shattered forever. And she would be the one to break it all. The grand hall was filled with the soft hum of anticipation as guests settled into their seats, waiting for the arrival of the bride. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, and the music, light and elegant, drifted through the room like a soft breeze. Sarah, glowing in her wedding dress, stepped into the spotlight, her heart swelling with excitement. This was the moment she had been dreaming of for years. The day she would marry the love of her life, Mark. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked with Mark's, and the world seemed to blur around them. The gentle whisper of fabric, the soft murmur of the crowd, none of it mattered. All that mattered was Mark, standing at the altar, waiting for her. His smile was everything Sarah had ever wanted. It was perfect. But in the background, unnoticed by everyone except Evelyn, something dark was brewing. Evelyn, standing in the front row, forced a smile, but her eyes were wide with terror, her hands clutched tightly in front of her, betraying the fear that was slowly consuming her. Every step Sarah took toward Mark was a step closer to the irrevocable truth that Evelyn could no longer escape. As the ceremony progressed, the energy in the room shifted ever so slightly. The words of the vows, once comforting and joyous, now seemed distant to Evelyn. She couldn't focus on anything but the cold emptiness inside her. Each "I do" from Mark felt like a nail in the coffin of everything Evelyn had worked so hard to protect. Sarah continued to gaze lovingly at Mark, her voice trembling with excitement as she recited her vows. The crowd cheered, but Evelyn couldn't bring herself to join them. Every word Sarah spoke seemed like a confirmation that the life she once shared with Mark had been reduced to nothing. She had lost him, and now, her daughter was about to give him everything she could never have. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and her breath hitched as she watched Mark's eyes meet hers across the room. For a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a dark, heavy recognition that neither could ignore. Mark's expression faltered for just a second, but only Evelyn saw it. She knew, in that fleeting moment, that he wasn't the man he pretended to be. And in that instant, the first whispers of doubt began to creep into Sarah's mind. Something was wrong. Something wasn't right. But Sarah, caught in the bliss of her wedding day, pushed the thought away, burying it beneath her joy and excitement. The ceremony reached its climax, and Sarah's heart swelled as she took Mark's hands in hers, ready to declare her life to him. But the moment was abruptly interrupted by a piercing scream. No. Evelyn's voice rang out across the hall, jagged and raw, tearing through the delicate atmosphere like a thunderclap. Everyone turned to see her standing, trembling, at the back of the aisle, her face twisted with a mixture of terror and rage. She raised a shaking hand toward Mark, her eyes burning with something Sarah couldn't comprehend. Mark, still holding Sarah's hands, looked up at Evelyn in confusion. His mouth parted in surprise as the crowd shifted nervously. "Mom," Sarah began, but her words faltered as she turned to face her mother. "Evelyn," Mark said quietly, his voice thick with unease. "What's happening?" Evelyn took a step forward, her lips trembling. "You don't get to have her," she spat, her voice harsh and hoarse. "You've already taken everything from me." The guests fell silent, the room thick with confusion. Evelyn's words hung in the air like a threat, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned back to Mark, eyes wide, her heart pounding. In one swift, terrifying movement, Evelyn reached out, her hand trembling as she grabbed a knife from the table beside her. Sarah's eyes went wide in disbelief, her mind unable to process the horror unfolding before her. Before anyone could react, Evelyn plunged the knife deep into Mark's chest. The room froze as Mark gasped, his eyes wide with shock. His hands gripped at his chest, but it was too late. Time seemed to slow as Mark's body crumpled to the floor, a pool of blood quickly spreading beneath him. His face, once filled with love for Sarah, was now twisted in shock and pain. For a split second, Sarah couldn't move. She could only stare, her mind reeling as the man she was supposed to spend the rest of her life with lay dying on the floor. His blood stained the white carpet beneath him, turning the perfect day into a grotesque nightmare. Evelyn stood over him, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of grief and fury. Her chest heaved with every breath, and her hand, still clutching the knife, trembled uncontrollably. "Mom!" Sarah whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. The tremor in her voice was the only sound in the room. Evelyn turned to her, her face an unreadable mask. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I couldn't let him take everything." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she dropped to her knees beside Mark. "Why?" she whispered again, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Why did you do this?" Evelyn's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then the hardness returned. She stepped back slowly, her face unreadable, as she dropped the knife onto the floor. Sarah, still kneeling beside Mark's lifeless body, struggled to breathe. The reality of the moment, the overwhelming pain and the betrayal suffocated her. The man she loved was gone, and the woman she had trusted most in the world had taken his life. Everything had shattered in an instant, and Sarah could do nothing but stare at her mother, her heart breaking in pieces she didn't know how to put back together. The wedding guests had long since scattered, some rushing out of the hall in terror, others standing frozen, unsure of what to do. The police had arrived, their sirens cutting through the quiet streets, but for Sarah, the noise of the world was distant. Her mind was a blur, her body numb as she sat in a corner of the hall, her eyes empty, her hands trembling. The sound of Evelyn's arrest was barely audible over the pounding of Sarah's heart in her ears. Evelyn was led away in handcuffs, her head hung low, her face a mask of sorrow and regret. But no apology could take back what she had done. She had destroyed everything. Sarah's heart ached with every step she took. She couldn't bear to look at her mother anymore, couldn't understand how the woman who had given her life could be the same person who had torn her world apart. As the police questioned her, Sarah sat in stunned silence, the weight of the moment sinking deeper into her soul. Her wedding day, the day she had imagined for so long, had been stolen from her in the most brutal way possible. And as the flashing lights outside the hall signaled the end of this night, Sarah realized that she would never be the same again. The life she had planned, the love she had dreamed of, had been shattered in one incomprehensible act of violence. And in the ruins of that day, Sarah was left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart.